We are known as the indispensable nation for good reason.
What's your take? Do you think we should be leading the world or focusing here at home?
Well, if your car is broken, you're not driving it anywhere.
I suggested that we arm those groups that we knew to actually support the principles we would support.
Are we really trying to democratize, or are we trying to protect based upon an imagined fear of other people?
As we mentioned, Donald Trump today called for more military spending, more troops, more ships, more submarines, more planes.
I've got a son in Afghanistan right now, and he's fighting for something, right? So I'd like to think he's fighting for the principles that we believe in.
Our allies are relying on us to do certain things in the world, and we're just not doing them.
America has to have a presence. We have to lead. We have to show other countries how to do it, but not necessarily do it for them.
Several surveys, including one of our own here at the Eurasia Group Foundation, have found a stark contrast between the public's views about American foreign policy and those of foreign policy makers themselves. There's a lot of research to show that foreign policy leaders and the general public view America's role in the world somewhat differently. What do you think accounts for that?
I think it's a natural human occurrence that people tend to worry about things that they spend a lot of time thinking about. Most Americans don't spend a lot of their time thinking about foreign policy and how it affects them, even though it affects them in profound ways.
Americans are concerned about events at home. I think they're, like most people around the world, worried about their jobs and unemployment and good education for their kids and healthcare and all the rest. So that differs obviously from the people in this town that make a career out of tracking foreign policy.
I think the biggest difference is that the average member of the American public is really uninterested. An extraordinary amount of resource being spent on international endeavors that they believe either do not help them or perhaps actively harm them.
If you ask the public what's the most pressing issue in foreign policy, they're going to talk about taking actions to preserve jobs.
The underlying message is the same, that America is somehow doing too much.
Has the foreign policy establishment always been this somewhat disconnected from public opinion?
Oh, there's always been a gap between the foreign policy establishment and the needs and desires of the average American. But I think, first of all, the average American was indifferent to many of these things, and now the gap is much more prioritized. It's much more real and potent notion of, what do we spend on defense? What do we do internationally?
We often tend to think of a democracy in which the voters decide, they have an opinion. And it is the responsibility of policymakers to enact those policy preferences, to be faithful. We sometimes call that the delegate theory of representation. But there's another way of looking at democracy, that what an elected official owes to the voter is his or her best judgment.
One of the most difficult decisions that I've made as president, I ordered an additional 30,000 American troops into Afghanistan.
Obama felt, and I think rightly, that he was elected to get us out of a place like Afghanistan. And yet, after a quite lengthy review of our policy in Afghanistan, he took the decision to surge the number of forces in Afghanistan. We all knew that probably wouldn't be that popular, not only with our own party, but with the general American public.
I was a speechwriter for Secretary Clinton several years ago, and the kinds of things that were talked about within the walls of the State Department seemed so obscure and wonky that you would look for ways to use different language to discuss them when you were writing the speech about it. Now, all of a sudden, there's a much broader debate about what international order means.
So you're always going to have situations in which the policymaker is going to have to make choices the public may or may not agree with. So, it's a fundamental question about what it is that lawmakers owe their voters.
The example that really stands out to me, when George Marshall proposed the Marshall Plan, we see it now as this kind of great moment in American foreign policy. It was not totally clear that it was going to pass because people did not want to send millions of dollars to problems overseas. They thought we should spend that money at home. And it took Marshall spending months and months and months flying around the country, making the case to Americans that it was not just worth doing, not just in our best interest to do, but really essential to do.
Why must the United States carry so great a load in helping Europe? The 6 8/10 billion proposed for the first 15 months is less than a single month's charge of the war. This unprecedented endeavor of the new world to help the old is neither sure nor easy.
He managed to really skillfully combine that appeal to a kind of lofty self-image with the more prosaic, self-interested concerns. And I think that's the kind of message that we need to revive again.
There have been these moments where it's not paternalistic, where the Americans do rise up and they say there's something that we should all stand for. But this is the antithesis of one of those moments. And let's recognize that this isn't a normal gap we're talking about. This is much greater than that. I think it's very dangerous to have a foreign policy establishment whose argument is essentially becoming increasingly, we know better than you what's good for you.
If you don't invest the time into explaining what your policies are, listening to those that might have an alternative viewpoint, and explaining your final decision, whatever that might be, you will often pay the price politically.